Hey, how's it going? I'm back to talk about imaginary numbers. What is an imaginary number? An imaginary number looks like this. So we just have 10i. But in this case, I is not a variable. It's not like, say, 10x or 10y. I actually has a significance. And in this case, I is what we call an imaginary unit. If I could spell imaginary, an imaginary unit. So imaginary units are represented by the letter I. And this means nothing to you until you learn that I is equal to the square root of -1. We've been taught that we can't take square roots of negative numbers. And using imaginary numbers helps us rationalize complex numbers. So this gives us a method to simplify numbers like that. So I is the imaginary unit, and I is equal to the square root of -1. So let's say that we have I squared. We would have I times I, and that is the same equivalent to square root of -1 times the square root of -1. And you may have guessed that that's going to equal -1. So I squared is equal to -1. I to the third. I times I times I. That's 3 square roots of -1. Multiplied by each other, of course. So we'd get 1 square root of -1 times 1 square root of -1 equals -1, and we still have that extra square root of -1. Our final result is you can either say it's equal to -1 I, sorry, not I squared, just -1 I, or the negative square root of -1. You can go a little further here. I to the fourth. I'm not going to write them out because I'll take up the entire space here, but we'd have 4 of these square roots of -1. So we'd have 2 -1s. Well, maybe I should write it out. Just to give the visual. So we'd have these two combined and these two combined. So this would equal -1, this would equal -1, and -1 times -1 equals 1. Pretty straightforward. So I'm going to get this out of the way and go a little further than I to the fourth. You can apply this to huge numbers. So let's say we have I to the fifth now. That's the equivalent to I to the fourth times I. We know that I to the fourth is 1 because it's -1 times -1. And I is just I, or we can write this as one times the square root of -1. So the square root of -1. So you can either write this as just I or the square root of -1. I to the sixths. We'd have I to the fourth times I squared. We know that I to the fourth is equal to 1. I squared is 2 of these square roots of -1, so we'd have just -1, resulting in -1. I to the 7th power, I to the 4th times I to the 3rd. So we'd have 1 times -1. I'll write this one out. We know that I to the 4th is 1. And I to the 3rd can be divided into I to the 2nd times I. So we'd have 1 times, and I to the 2nd is the square root of -1 times 2. So we'd have -1. And then I is the square root of -1. So we can either write it as the square root of -1 or just I. Multiply this together and we'd have -I, or the negative square root of -1. I to the 8th is an easy one. You just have I to the 4th times I to the 4th, which is just 1 times 1, and that equals 1. So you can see that every time we count up by 4, we reset back to I to the 4th or 1. So with larger numbers, you can just divide by 4 and apply this to the remainder. So it's pretty straightforward.